Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here. Long time no see. Today we are taking the Orange Dark Terror on what is probably its final drive around the channel to explore what I consider to be a fairly comprehensive yet compact, doomy, sludgy, stonery type of metal rig. If you've watched any of my videos in the past, you will no doubt have been greeted by some form of contemporary guitar tone that some might describe as tight or grindy. Well, much like the other B-side installments of the Tone Engineer series, today we're going for something a little bit different, and in fact I would call this the anti-tight rig. Not to say that Ola couldn't make this chug, but that we're going for stuff that I think isn't necessarily nice or produced, and that's kind of the whole point here, and that's why I would give this a fairly broad title. Yes, when I plug into this thing and use a lot of the gear that we'll be using today, doom metal and all of its subgenres is very much the type of music I'm inspired to play with this rig, but of course it also covers all of those aforementioned sludge and stoner tones that ultimately all kind of branch off from this Sabbath-inspired sound, whether we're talking about something more fast and contemporary like High on Fire, or batshit crazy and avant-garde like Sun. That's the kind of stuff we're shooting for. And I think with something as simple as this and a few select pedals, you can do basically all of that. So let's get the show on the road by covering the dry rig, so to speak, that you'll be hearing throughout this entire video. The same amplifier, the same cabinet, same microphone combination, and that all starts for at least all but one demo with the same guitar that I was using in the previous Tone Engineer, my Gibson SGJ. As some of you pointed out, it is not exactly stock. I got the Gibson TP6 bridge here, or tailpiece rather, that does make for all these wacky tunings that I'm playing today much more easy to swap between. And I've got the Kaler string locking nut up here just for added stability. Otherwise, tonally speaking, it's, well, it used to be a fairly affordable Gibson guitar, but I really like the sound of it. You know, PAF-style humbuckers. For a lot of this, I'm going to be keeping my tone control well below 10, which is something I normally wouldn't do for more contemporary sounds, because you don't necessarily want the tone suck. You don't want to bleed off a lot of that high frequency content. But for this, the kind of honky, you know, mid-focus sound that induces plays very well with the types of genres that we're going for. So it'll be anywhere between like 5 and 8 generally, but dial it into taste depending on your guitar and pot tolerances and all that good stuff. For one of the more vintage tone demonstrations, I'll be playing my 1978 Electra Tree of Life SG-shaped guitar, lawsuit era, definitely. And instead of having PAF-style humbuckers, this has a P90 that is the size of a humbucker. So it pretty much sounds like a P90, but it provides a little bit different flavors of tone, and I'll talk about why I prefer to use this over the humbuckers. But for the most part, if you had to pick one type of guitar to use for the kind of genres I'm playing here, it's going to be a 24 3/4 inch scale length Gibson style guitar. Active pickups can be totally fine. For me, a lot of this stuff doesn't work without the volume roll-off behavior and the voicing of more vintage style passive pickups, so that would be my recommendation. It doesn't have to be a Gibson, obviously, and given their shenanigans here in the past couple of years, I would recommend against one, but totally different conversation. Our amplifier head choice for the day is obviously, once again, the Orange Dark Terror. Not a whole lot to go over that I haven't already said in prior videos. It has an insanely large gain range that is usable throughout almost all of its spectrum. The master volume control is very usable as well in terms of dialing in the amount of power tube compression and influence you want on your sound while still being mostly manageable at either 7 or 15 watts. I still felt like an attenuator was kind of necessary on a couple of these tones, but for keeping up with a drummer, this can do that, especially if you have a larger cabinet, especially one larger than I'm using in this video. And the shape control does the job. I would prefer to have a little bit more powerful EQ section, but between microphones and maybe you can throw an EQ in the loop, I think that you can get the recorded guitar sound that you're after. And as I've mentioned in the past as well, this thing takes pedals like a dream, and you can make it sound, well, like an orange, or you can make it sound like a big fuzzball, or about everything in between. What's not to like? Now, as much as I've enjoyed ripping this thing through a 412 cabinet, that wouldn't exactly be keeping in line with the compact angle of this video. So instead, I'm using my Marshall 1936, which comes stock with 2 T75 speakers. I have replaced one of them with a greenback, although I'm still miking up the T75 side. And I've turned it 90 degrees to sit on its side and become a vertical 212 with kind of an asymmetrical baffling there. But it sounds really great either way, whether it's on its side or, you know, in its intended position. And I feel like it's a good compromise tonally, and space and weight savings, all those things that play into, you know, still sounding beefier than most 2x12s in my opinion. But, you know, you're not carrying the size of a full-grown adult in terms of weight either. So for me, you know, if you're going to try to play something like this live, or even if it's just a rehearsal, the kind of genres we're talking about are not direct to the board kind of tones, in my opinion. Not to say you can't get good sounds that way, but if you want that out loud doom, you know, stoner type of vibe, I think this, you know, a 2x12 vertical especially, this whole philosophy is a really great way to go. Finally, for the microphone selection, I'm once again using a blend of the trusty SM57 and my Cam Crystal, which is a Neumann style knockoff. And generally for these kind of genres, just like in the last Tone Engineer, I would say, like, you know, chuck up an SM57 6 to 8 inches away and find the sweet spot, call it a day. You know, this is the kind of the bare minimum, not really produced kind of guitar tone type of genres. For me though, the condenser mic really helped beef up the low mids, and it added something that the 57 was definitely missing. A lot of body in the low end and too much scratchiness that, you know, no amount of positioning or depth could fix. So I really like the blend here, and I guess the added room resonance and being in a corner that it should not be in, all those wrong things played together to make a tone that I thought was pretty cool. My favorite part of these tone showcase videos is without a doubt the pedal section, and this one is a really interesting one because with this group of genres specifically, there are so many options and it is so easy to get lost in the minutia of the fuzz pedals and the distortion pedals, and maybe you want a booster here and this weird effect, and it can get a little overwhelming. You know, with more contemporary metal, it's like, okay, pick your favorite boost pedal and maybe a delay and reverb, and, you know, a lot of that stuff just kind of works. There is room for creativity, of course, but just some of the palettes of tones that are at your disposal and then stuff that works with a lot of this kind of music, there's just a lot more to go around. But I feel like if you pick 3 or 4 or 5 different gain style pedal stuff that is adding distortion to your signal in different ways, you'll be able to do just about anything. So I'm going to mention a few honorable, well, mentions and go over pedals that I would probably have on my board if I were to make this a full-blown rig. Perhaps this would bring it beyond the definition of compact for some people, but maybe not. And then I'll spend a little more time on the types of pedals I feel like are absolutely necessary for at least me to be able to cover these types of tones. And I'm primarily covering dry tones here. You know, we're talking about dirt boxes and boosts and tube amplifiers, but while we're on the subject, let's quickly cover wet effects, you know, stuff that lives in the time domain, stuff like phaser or delay or reverb or chorus or, you know, rotary. All those effects that, you know, can play nicely with other genres, but once again, with a lot of these subgenres of doom metal and sludge and stoner and what have you, being kind of direct, or at least more direct descendants of a lot of the vintage style tones we associate with in terms of, you know, early classic rock, then it kind of works to have some of these more vintage style effects, stuff that sounds like a Leslie rotary speaker or you know, a tape echo machine. So you have a lot of options, and it's going to come down to the way that you want to use them creatively, but there are certainly a few that I would have on the board no matter what. Personally, I would choose one or two of my favorite modulation devices, something like my Mxr Phase 90 Zakk Wylde signature, especially when you place it in front of all of your drive pedals and the amplifier. It has that cool vintage warbly wobble thing going on that isn't chorus, but it's also not flanger. And the placement of all these time effects, I think, is important, and you are flexible, but whereas a lot of more contemporary genres, I would almost always say, you know, put your reverb in the effects loop or put it post whatever. For a lot of this, I think it is cool if you have a little bit of dirt on the amplifier and let it interact with that in front of the amp. Stuff like echo, things that people used to put in front of amplifiers. You could still make something like a Boss DD7 sound cool. A lot of these are just staples that you see in a lot of these types of rigs. Your favorite reverb pedals, what have you. The Dark Terror, of course, does have an effects loop, so you could take advantage of your echo effects post-preamp, but again, for a lot of this stuff, if you're driving your amplifier and getting most of your distortion from a pedal, it could be cool to experiment with the order. My next honorable mention comes directly from the father of doom metal himself, Mr. Tony Iommi. And while this unassuming spray-painted green junction box may not look like a whole lot, if you watched the previous video, you might know that this actually contains the circuit of a Dallas Rangemaster Treble Booster. A lot of people, when they get started, you know, trying to learn Sabbath riffs and that sort of thing, they hear that sound, they hear a lot of the sounds of fuzz players and think, oh, well, he was obviously using a fuzz pedal. And that's a totally fair misunderstanding, because as it turns out, this circuit has a lot of the same quirks that many fuzz pedals do, except that it only has one transistor in the circuit versus, you know, 2, 3, 4 or more. So for those of you that really enjoy those more vintage style tones, I would absolutely recommend that you try a treble booster, specifically one that has different capacitor options for the input roll-off frequency, because if you just plug in a humbucker equipped guitar into an amp like this with the stock settings, it's going to sound really piercing and probably pretty terrible, as the original treble booster circuit was designed to do just that, to compensate for darker guitars and amplifiers with a darker voicing than something like this. But what Tony Iommi and Brian May and many of their techs discovered is that if you replace one critical capacitor in here, you can change how much bass content you're letting through. And when you let most of the full frequency spectrum of your guitar through one of these and crank up the gain, it has a really cool, spitty, fuzzy quality that, especially when you paired with a plexi style amplifier, just it's a really great sound. While it no doubt sounds great with humbucker equipped guitars, and you're going to be hearing just how fat it gets on a neck humbucker, I'm also going to be demonstrating it the way that I feel it should be with a P90 in the bridge. My third and final recommendation probably has a questionable reputation among this crowd of guitar players, but hear me out. The Boss HM2 circuit. As a lot of people discovered when first buying these pedals before they were discontinued, it's not so much of a high gain tight type of sound as it is a cross between a traditional distortion and fuzz pedal, because if you look at the actual circuit of a Boss HM2, it does resemble more of a multi-stage fuzz pedal in a lot of ways than something like a DS1. So it's no surprise that as you crank the gain, it has this spitty quality that is anything but tight. Obviously, when you combine it with like the Metal Zone and put it in front of certain amplifiers, there is the Swedish death metal chainsaw guitar sound. But if you tweak the mid knob and the bass and play with the gain versus how it's interacting with the amplifier gain structure, you get some really cool sounds that I would describe as a big muff on bath salts, more or less, and I'll let you be the judge of that. Now then, for the three pedals that I would choose as my must-have dirt pedals for this kind of rig, ones that don't necessarily have to be this exact pedal, but something that does this job and has this general sound signature. My first pick would be a generic Fet Booster. This is actually a pedal that you will probably not be able to buy. I actually didn't even buy this pedal. I bought another pedal and it came with it free. How cool. But something that is not a clean boost. And what I mean by clean boost is, you know, if you got a perfectly clean circuit that can amplify your signal by 20 decibels, that's great, and that can be really useful for this kind of amplifier. But frankly, this amp has plenty of gain on tap and plenty of distortion on its own, to the point that that's not what I'm using this for. What I like about the Fet Boost is, once again, kind of in the same spirit of fuzz pedals or the aforementioned Treble Booster, is this circuit, once you crank the gain on the Fet, which is a field effect transistor, you get a distortion quality that doesn't really sound like it's coming from either a pedal or a tube amplifier. If anything, it just sounds like a tube amp that's about to explode. It's really pushed and saturated in a way that I would almost liken to a console being overdriven, like transformer saturation or something. It's very cool. The Mxr Micro Amp does something like this, even though it is an op amp circuit. The Fet driver from Mxr, I would say, is a more direct replacement, even though in the demos I've heard it sounds a little more smooth, but maybe that will cover the territory you're after. Either way, I would try out as many as you can or listen to online demos and see what fulfills that role for you. But there is something irreplaceable about this driven Fet sound that when you hear it with an amp of this kind of voicing, you're kind of at home. This might be another maligned pick, but I don't care. The Proco Rat 2. I know, I hear you purists out there. It doesn't have the same LM308 op amp. The slew rate is different. It's not the big box version, and maybe the diodes or whatever. I don't care. If it were just a crap pedal that you could stick a 9-volt center negative power supply into, I would already be interested over the original big box versions. But you can set them side by side, massage the pots, eventually you will get them to sound the same. It's kind of been proven. Regardless of that, what I like about the Rat for this application is everything that I don't like about the Rat for any other. I don't think it's even really that great of a hard clipping pedal. I want hard clipping pedals to do a different kind of sound, at least for my taste. This is broken sounding when you turn the distortion high enough. I have explored, using this as kind of a thrashy boost, Metallica Kill 'Em All type of sound with volume high and, leaving a lot of the high frequency content and just barely turning distortion on to get some of that chewy texture. But you'll see here that you can go anywhere from a fairly nice hard clipping edge of fuzz sound with, any amount of low frequency content you want, all the way up to just like your amp is broken. You can barely recognize that as a guitar. And it's really cool for that. I'll mostly be sticking to around unity gain, but you can get a little bit of front end push if you turn up the volume. The filter control is of course backwards on certain versions of the Rat, but it's basically a low pass filter. And so if you roll it all the way off, you're gonna have a really boomy, honky kind of thing going on that is signature of this pedal. And for me, that makes it invaluable for this rig. We'll leave the simplest and perhaps the most obvious for last. It's a fuzz pedal. Of course it is. This has a single output volume control, and for good reason. This is a meathead circuit, and that is essentially a beefed up fuzz face. Now, a lot of players know the fuzz face trick is to just dime the drive and roll off with your volume if you want a cleaner sound. Some of the coolest clean sounds from the 60s and 70s, in my opinion, is a fuzz face with the volume rolled off on the guitar. And you can very much do that with this because it does have that tone suck behavior. Although with true bypass, once it's bypassed, it's out of the circuit and you have your clean, or not so clean amplifier sound. But you would think something with just an output volume would be a set and forget and you're done kind of pedal, but not so much, because the quality of distortion you get when you set the output volume high versus the output volume lower and then make up for it with your amplifier gain, totally different ballpark. So you can get kind of a more traditional classic fuzz sound out of this, especially if you do roll your volume off just slightly, which I think I do in a couple of these demos. But you can get just like, again, earth annihilating feedback monstrosity kind of sounds. It sounds like, construction equipment moving around. So this does both really well. It's not a nice effect. It's not something you show up and play a wedding gig with, but that's the whole point with today's video. All this stuff is kind of nasty, and that's what makes it so fun. And I suppose that pretty much wraps up today's edition of Tone Engineer. If anything, I hope that you found this to be a somewhat entertaining celebration of tones that I rarely cover on the channel. If I'm checking out a new pedal or amp or plugin, I will try to push it to the limit of, the sputtery, spitty messes that doom metal tones often are, if it can do it. But even then, I'm not quite the right player for the job when it comes to a lot of that stuff. Go watch Does It Doom instead. But with a lot of the material I've been working on that has been the more tight contemporary metal kind of sound, this has been a cool break. And hopefully, if you guys got more out of it than that, you've discovered maybe some pedals or concepts that would work for your style that maybe you weren't aware of, or ways to combine them, or maybe something that I'm not even aware of that I've done in this video. That would be cool too. So, any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. As always, thank you so very much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you on another artist-centric edition of Tone Engineer a little more soon. Bye.